How are you?
We are live tonight. This is Standing for Truth. I've got Godless Galaxy here, who has been kind enough to accept a discussion with myself. We will be discussing the creation model versus the evolutionary model, and looking at what better fits the evidence in regards to both models. Now, I want to thank Godless Galaxy for coming on tonight. Since he was gracious enough to come on, I'm going to have him introduce himself if he has a few things to say about his channel, some plans that he has with his channel. He can most certainly do so. And then Godless Galaxy, I'll give you a couple minutes, few minutes, whatever you need, no interruptions. I think it's important that not only myself, but the audience understands your position. That way we're not arguing against a straw man position. So take a couple minutes, take a few minutes, give us your, I guess, your model in a nutshell, what you believe is, the best evidence, say for if you accept evolution, best evidence for evolution, and then I'll do the same, couple minutes, and then we'll just have a free flowing dialogue from there. So go ahead, Godless Galaxy.
Thank you for having me here. Um, yeah, I am Godless Galaxy. My position is that the evolutionary, um, evolution, theory of evolution is true, as due to the evidence, it has. And I do believe in the Big Bang Theory, as it has a large amount of evidence for it too. And I do think that the evolution model does show clearly how species do form. With my channel, I do not know exactly what I'll be doing with it. I might be doing something, maybe a series, I don't know exactly. Um, One of the best evidence, I think, for evolution would be the fossil record, or that new species show up and to introduce.
What would you so you're saying that the fossil record is your best evidence? If you just wanted to take it just a little bit more time, kind of fleshing that out, maybe giving us a bit of a rundown as to how you came about, believing in the evolution theory as the best possible explanation for, say, the empirical evidence, empirical data that we see. Go ahead, Godless Galaxy.
All right. So, the reason why I do believe in evolution is because of, well, the fossil record clearly shows that simple life in the beginning, at the oldest layers, was single-celled, and that it slowly built up into diversity of species, where there was bones, there's vertebrates, there's dinosaurs, and then it clearly shows a lot of change in how this process took forever, and not forever, but this process took millions and billions of years to happen. And using multiple dating methods that have been verified by each other, it's clearly shown that that these rock layers are old, and that the fossils are also as the same age. Um, and the evolution is clearly shown with the fossil record, as it demonstrates from simple life to more complex, as the theory of evolution clearly states.
Okay, awesome, Godless Galaxy. Um, Thank you for your opening there. There'll be a few things for us to talk about, of course. I think in regards to the biblical-based model and in regards to evolution, I would say that the word evolution itself is a slippery term. If you mean by evolution, domestic dogs and wolves are related through common ancestry, then I would say I'm a firm believer in evolution. But if by evolution you mean dogs and banana plants are related through common ancestry, then that would be something that I would certainly reject. And if you say that that's something that there's empirical evidence for, I would say that you're sadly mistaken. But if we're looking at a biological definition of evolution, I would say evolution means a change in allele frequency in populations over generations or over time. Now, the question is, does that change have a limit? So I think that's a huge part in regards to coming to a valid conclusion on the evidence. Now, if we look at the driving force behind this type of fish to fisherman evolution, the evolutionists will say that it's mutation and natural selection. Now, you can see a slide that I presented that talks about human generation, or in other words, the entropic degeneration of our genome. Now, we know that human mutation is catastrophic. The question is, can natural selection and mutation build the genome? Now, we know that all non-neutral mutations are actually deleterious, and it's a fact that we inherit a multitude of mutations from our parents and grandparents. Now, from the very first division of our zygote, we actually begin to add new mutations to this genetic load. We accumulate mutations at the rate of approximately 3 new mutations every cell division throughout our entire lifetime. So that growing genetic load is actually what causes aging and limits the upper life limit of our race. And so we die. It's a fact that we die mainly because of this mutation accumulation. Now, the problem with this mutation accumulation is that it doesn't only affect us on a personal level, but it actually affects us on a population level, because we pass on these mutations that we have inherited and that we have generated to our children. And so our children should actually be more mutant than their parents consistently, which is why genetic load tends to accumulate continuously over time. Now, to put this into perspective for the audience and for Godless Galaxy here, it's widely known that human mutation rate is actually 100 mutations per person per generation. And so our children have about 100 more mutations than we have, and our grandchildren will have 100 more mutations than they have. This is extremely disturbing on a population level, because if there are 100 mutations per person and there are 7 billion people on the planet, then there is 700 billion new mutations entering the human population this generation. And so the big question, as I asked earlier, becomes what type of selection could actually eliminate so many mutations into the human population? Now, one objection or straw man that I've heard over and over again is that most mutations are neutral, but this response point at hand. So I'd rather just dismantle that straw man before we get into a discussion here, because I agree most mutations are neutral from the perspective of the organism's physical fitness, aka its phenotype, but all mutations must have effect on the genetic content. In no way are mutations truly neutral. They all must have effect on the genotype, even if it's something that, say, affects the efficiency of transfer RNA production. So at the end of the day, these mutations, they accumulate, they lead to this human genetic degeneration. And due to the influx of these deleterious mutations, the rare occurrence, and I'm sure this is something we're going to get into, of, say, beneficial mutations cannot, and I repeat, cannot compensate for the information loss. So if we see information loss, information degradation, how is this going to build the genome? And one last thing when it comes to the origin of species, because our model must be able to make testable and falsifiable predictions. So we look to the created heterozygosity hypotheses. And to put it into a nutshell, if the ancestors to, say, modern species possessed millions of heterozygous nuclear DNA sites, and that's just a fancy way of saying that God created incredible genetic diversity in his original created kinds. New species, I think it's logical, given the biblical model, that they arise naturally. Say through processes such as recombination and gene conversion, new nuclear chromosome combinations would arise each generation. Now, if you're following me thus far, when these processes involve millions of heterozygous sites, changes in visible traits are almost guaranteed to appear each generation. So it's obviously more technical than this, but to produce a new species, in a nutshell, these traits and nuclear DNA combinations must be isolated. So, say small population sizes, migration, inbreeding will lead to the founding of new, more homozygous populations. And as these more homozygous groups grow to larger and larger sizes, they will eventually be recognized as new species. So, based on created heterozygosity, based on created pre-existing DNA differences versus evolution, which predicts all DNA differences are based on mutation, this is a certainly plausible mechanism for generating the biodiversity that we see. Now, going into the discussion portion, I think it's important, and I'm sure we'll get into this in a little more detail, as well as the fossil record, which you talked about, Godless Galaxy. But when it comes to limits, do you believe that there's limits, whether it's physical, genomic? For example, do you believe that we can, say, get a dog as small as, say, a mouse, a pygmy mouse? Because we know they're both mammals, and we know there's animals as small as a mouse, like a mouse. Or do you believe we can get a dog, say, as big as an elephant? Because we do know that there's mammals as big as an elephant, like an elephant. Go ahead, Godless Galaxy.
Well, discussing the size, I would think it is a very slim possibility. We have like the Chihuahua, which is very small, but making it as small as a mouse seems slightly impossible with its genome with the genetic pool. But yes, it's possible that it could happen due to artificial selection by humans.
So, do you like? Would you say that based on universal common ancestry, um, dogs and mice, or dogs, mice, and elephants are all related through common ancestry?
Yes,
Oh, can you hear me, Godless Galaxy?
yes,
Okay, so would you agree that universal common ancestry teaches and proposes that dogs, elephants, and mice are all related through common ancestry?
yes.
Okay, so in order to, say, go from single cell to multi-cell to fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal, bird, monkey, man, that's going to take incredible addition of new, novel, and meaningful genetic information. So based on the fact that I think we agree that there are limits, whether it's soft limits, physical limits, genomic limits, what's that mechanism that's going to add this new, novel information to the genome to even make molecules to man evolution a plausible hypothesis? Go ahead.
All right. So you were talking about how mutations can be neutral and like how they can outweigh beneficial. With neutral, I don't know exactly the effects of mutations if they're neutral, but I have heard that because some genes are replicated, which creates the same gene or whatever, and not gene, like genetic information, that new copy genetic information can do whatever it wants to, and the old genetic information can stay as its same process to keep everything stabilized. And so, with that new information, you can get a variety of new things. And because of these new mutations, you can get a lot of new mutations that will be able to become independent from their copied version. So, um, the mutation of feathers for dinosaurs, as they were slowly evolving, feathers were just could have possibly been used for appeasing other sex or camouflaging. And as time went on, it became the slightly more feathered dinosaurs that were lighter and had longer arm spreads can use feathers to slightly increase their agility. And so, as time would go on, those who were faster would survive. So what I'm trying to get here is that mutations are the driving force that can give these new features, due to the fact that they can become neutral mutations, and they can become independent from other.
Okay, and thanks for that response. Now, I understand that the evolutionary theory does propose that mutations are the driving force of evolution, but if mutation is generally catastrophic, and these, this accumulation of, say, these near neutral mutations are building up in the genome, obviously selection must somehow prevent, and I hope we can agree to this, the accumulation of large numbers of, say, these minor mutations, or the species will obviously, quickly deteriorate and fitness will actually decline. But even if selection could keep minor mutations in check, it appears to be absolutely powerless to stop the accumulation of the most abundant class, right? These nearly neutral mutations that I was talking about earlier. That means that higher genomes must eventually all degenerate in the long run, with or without selection. Just like my slide here indicates that, no form of selection can actually stop this genetic degradation. Sure, it can slow it down, but it can't actually stop it. So it seems to me that, based on the empirical evidence, mutations, they're not construction, they're destruction. So how are you going to build a genome? By, for one, losing information, and secondly, how are you going to compensate for this accumulation of these, information losing deleterious mutations? Go ahead, Godless Galaxy.
All right. So natural selection does not choose the fittest; it chooses the best to reproduce. So if a
Yeah.
mutation would badly affect an animal, so like if a mouse had a mutation that would make it lose a leg, but it was able to survive, it would be able to reproduce that mutation and continue that. Natural selection can get rid of many mutations that could be beneficial, neutral, or negative. Natural selection does not entirely care unless you just reproduce. That's all that matters. So you can't just say, since if it's not constructive, it's deconstructive. I would strongly disagree with that, as some animals, they get mutations, like many humans, they get mutations and they don't even know about it, and it does not impact their life, which can clearly happen within nature and with many other animals. They can still have a small mutation, and that would, I don't completely understand what you mean by like it would build up, but it could build up in a positive way. I don't know how it could possibly build up in a negative way if somehow those mutations were to do some major damage. But these mutations building up will possibly give benefits, as if like a mouse would get one mutation that would slightly increase something, and then another population of mice would have a mutation that would increase something else, and they were to interbreed or whatever, they would both have the mutation, and that would build up, which would be positive for them.
Well, see, here's the problem is that I think when it comes to, natural selection, or say adaptation, I agree with you that it definitely explains fine tuning to an environment, but is it going to explain, the amazing internal workings of life? Because I think when it comes to these mutations that you're talking about, and selection pressures, selecting for certain traits, I think if we look at, the bottom line, it's the fact that selection only removes the worst deleterious mutations and then amplifies only the best beneficial mutations. So when I talk about these near neutral mutations accumulating in the genome, it's because natural selection, Godless Galaxy, it acts on the phenotype. Okay, so it's either every single nucleotide or none at all. Now, this means that the accumulating damage is largely invisible, say like rust on a car. Now, adaptations, as you were talking about, they actually tend to be highly visible, say like antibiotic resistance. But that means you'd have to present us with, millions of examples of, say, adaptation via beneficial point mutation, duplications, whatever type of mutation you want, you would still be failing to address the key issue in order to make fish to fisherman evolution even plausible. And that key issue would actually be net gain versus net loss. Because like I said, we both agree that adaptation explains fine tuning to an environment, but for one, it doesn't explain how a population, how natural selection is going to select for these near neutral mutations. And secondly, it's not going to explain how natural selection and mutations can actually build the genome, right? I mean, there's a famous population geneticist named Kondrashov. He's actually stated, based on these near neutral mutations, because we're actually accumulating 700 billion mutations per generation. And most of these mutations, if you looked at that chart I had up earlier, they're in the non-selection zone. So what he said was, why are we not dead 100 times over? So the whole point is that there's obviously a shelf life on genomes, which obviously gives us a very long-term problem. And if beneficials cannot counterbalance the deleterious ones, Godless Galaxy, then these low impact mutations continuously accumulate. So for one, this is consistent with biblical creation in the fall, because when Adam and Eve fell and mutations began accumulating in the population, we see this steady decline curve, and it's consistent with biblical creation, but it's inconsistent with pond scum to people evolution, because based on that problem, based on that fact that these population geneticists widely recognize, it's not going to build the genome. It's not going to take your bacteria to biologist. Go ahead, Godless Galaxy.
How big of the population do you think the humans were before the flood or whatever?
Oh, I think you cut out there. If you want to maybe get closer to either your microphone and then repeat your question.
How big do you think the human population was before the flood or whatever?
So was it like before large? The flood?
Yeah, or like before the fall. Like...
I would say that it was a large population, but there would have been a larger population of animals, right? God created 2 humans, but then he created numerous populations of animals, original created kind. So certainly, but it's hard to say exactly what the population of humans were, but they would, at that point, it would have been at least point of genetic entropy. So the accumulating damage wouldn't be to the point that it is now. Because in the Bible, we read about, people living, Adam lived into the 900s, and we see that steady decline in age. And we can rightly and logically conclude that at least part of it is based on that accumulation, or that mutation accumulation problem. And what's interesting is that decay curve, the linear decay curve is consistent with the same curve that we see in the scriptures based on that decrease in age. Go ahead.
So what would be the difference? Because you say humans lived for 900 to 700 years and it steadily declined, whatever. What would be the animals? I mean, if we are just like if our genetics were to build up like animals did, then shouldn't the animals be a lot worse than us?
So when we actually do, and that's a good question, when we actually do experiments, so like obviously my question is, how can we stop mutation accumulation? It's a good question that you ask, but if we actually look today, diseases such as Alzheimer's, dementia, autism, asthma, autoimmune disorders, cancers, immunological disorders, a lot of them are, based on epigenetic mutation, but it is a pandemic. And even 50 years ago, the elderly used to be considered wise, and now we see this tremendous increase in these, Alzheimer's and dementia type diseases. So we certainly see entropic degeneration on all levels, and even in animals. For example, They're doing a long-term E. coli experiment, so just in bacteria, because a lot of times an objection to genetic entropy would be, why don't we see it in bacteria? But we actually see entropic decay I'm not sure if you're familiar with Lenski's experiment, but he's actually observed reductive evolution because there's been adaptation, but no new function, and all beneficial mutations have been reductive. Now, what that means is it's a loss of function. They've seen a loss of promoter genes. Now, these bacteria are actually painting themselves into a corner. They're lazy, they're handicapped, and they're actually getting rid of genes short term. But what it is it's long term degeneration. So we're seeing this entropic decay, obviously in humans. We're seeing it in bacteria, and we're actually seeing it in the influenza, the H1N1, because for 70 years plus, we've seen the influenza virus. There's been a linear decay curve, just as predicted in genetic entropy, and there's been a linear accumulation of mutations, right? So clearly genetic entropy is at work, and there's been a decline of the H1N1, and it completely went extinct. Now there is an H1N1 human version. That's the one that went extinct, but there's also a swine version that's currently circulating, but the other one actually went extinct. So we're seeing it on all levels. And it wouldn't have been that way immediately post-fall or immediately post-flood. But we're certainly seeing that buildup currently, right? There's a lot of empirical data for it. How do you feel about that, Godless Galaxy?
I'm not completely familiar with this because you brought this new subject to me. But as far as I know, so because of these new populations and new genes build up, these mutations should destroy us. Exactly. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, like if this accumulation of mutations cannot be stopped, if selection cannot keep these minor mutations in check, then higher genomes will eventually degenerate in the long run. And I would say with or without selection. Selection can probably slow it down, but it won't stop it. Like, how do you feel it can be stopped? If they're building up in our genome and they're unselectable and they're invisible, like rust on a car, how do you feel? What's the mechanism that's going to stop this degeneration problem?
Well, that's a tough question because I don't know exactly. But if these new genes are possibly going to harm one another, it's possible that some other processes that I don't know exactly could be stopping this. But let me think.
I know if you study like, and if you're not completely familiar with it, that's understandable. I will say that a few of the rescue devices, because I've talked to many scientists on this, read many papers on it. There's two major mechanisms. More ill-informed people and critics of this, especially some I've debated, they'll use natural selection, beneficial mutations, as a resolution for it. But that's just obviously not true. As I've stated earlier, I don't want to repeat myself, but and
Yeah.
natural selection might be able to slow it down. But the thing is, more informed critics, especially population geneticists, though there's two mechanisms. It's called mutation count mechanism and synergistic epistasis, it's called. So what they'll say, Godless Galaxy, is that, like, for example, a mutation count mechanism, they'll say as mutations accumulate, Mother Nature somehow counts the number of mutations per person, and then Mother Nature selects the higher number of individuals. But there's actually been simulations that have disproven this, and it's really not biologically real. And synergistic epistasis as well. And some people in the chat, if they're more informed on this genetic entropy problem, they're probably more than familiar with it. But they'll say that if we have lots of mutations that are deleterious, as they accumulate, they amplify each other's deleterious effects. So the intensity of degeneration is so great that somehow it improved selection, but it's actually been demonstrated that introducing this synergistic epistasis only makes the problem worse. And that's actually what logic would dictate. So really, there hasn't been any solution or plausible resolution to this problem. But the whole point of it all is that it's consistent with creation, but inconsistent with evolution. Go ahead, Godless Galaxy.
So it's consistent with creation because the age of humans has decreased, correct?
Well, the age of humans has decreased. Empirical data suggests that there's a shelf life on genomes. So our genomes can't be old, they must be young. And yeah, based on the recordings in the Bible, that makes sense that a big degression in age was based on mutation accumulation. I would also say that there was environmental factors, pre-flood and all this, but a major factor in it was mutation accumulation. And Moses was even given the law that, you know, marrying people of close relation would have been forbidden, because we know that, you know, that can lead to genetic defects based on that mutation accumulation. But that wasn't prohibited pre-flood, because that mutation accumulation problem wasn't actually the major issue that it has been. Does that make sense?
Yes, but you bring up another point. That came in my thoughts. So you're saying because they stopped, they were able to have incest or marry their cousins or whatever before Moses' law, correct?
I mean, directly after creation, they would have had to, obviously, but based on, you know, the fact that they would have had pure genetic codes, that wouldn't have been a problem. It's a problem now, and it was a problem post flood, because that mutation accumulation problem was becoming an issue. So obviously that law was put into place. But yeah, you're correct.
So after the fall of man, would you say mutations, like negative mutations or neutral mutations, would have started, or were there always mutations?
I would say that the mutation, there's always been mutations after the fall, but and this would get into our heterozygosity model as well, because evolutionists say that the majority of differences are based on mutations. We say that the majority of differences are based on created heterozygosity. But before we get to that part, yeah, mutations would have begun accumulating after the fall. It wouldn't have been such a problem until, you know, hundreds or thousands of years later, leading up to obviously the accumulation of them in our genome. Because it's kind of like rust on the car, right? Like an individual piece of rust, it's not going to affect the fitness of the car, but over time they accumulate to the point where the car deteriorates, becomes functionless. So it's not that one, you know, piece of rust atom that actually affects the car. It's the accumulation of them, just like it's the accumulation of mutations that affect our genomes and puts a shelf life on the genomes. That's really the most important part. So um, was there another question you had?
Um,
I
no.
think to put it into perspective, let's take, I'm just going to use an example on top of my head. Let's say there's a room full of 100 people, okay? Now, selection acts on the phenotype as a whole, okay? It's either the entire individual or not at all. Now, the problem is there's a selection problem, okay? Because we're all mutant. So selection has to choose between mutant and more mutant. Now, there's a problem there, because say we eliminated 50 of the most mutant people of that room full of 100, and now we're left with 50. Well, we're still left with 50 people more mutant than the previous generation. So eventually, mutations will accumulate. We will become more mutant continuously. Selection can slow it down, but it can't stop it. And we see that linear decay curve in the empirical data, but we also see it recorded in the Bible. So either the biblical writers we're somehow familiar with advanced population genetics, or this really is a fact of life. And ultimately, that would be proof, or a strong proof, for the Bible, and not just all other religions, but for the Bible itself, because the Bible is what describes a point of least entropy, not only in the universe, but also on a genetic level. So that's why the Bible's most consistent with the scientific data. And that's why the Bible, as a starting point, makes the testable predictions. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. Um, so I'm not completely familiar with this, but I've been informed about how in the Babylonian times they didn't have a concept of zero, and they were based on the number of, I think, 12. And the reason why there's such high numbers in the Bible is because of these base numbers, and transcripting them and translating them would have ended up with these high numbers. And I'm just throwing this out there. You can probably correct me, or if you do know this, but I was told that these numbers were written off, or were incorrectly written because of how they were translated and how the Babylonians or whatever used their number system.
Now, I've heard that argument before, and I know that the calculations have been done, and it just wouldn't make sense, because then there's, you know, biblical figures that apparently, according to their age as recorded in the Bible, they would have had kids at really young, ridiculous ages, like 5 or 6 or something. But I think most importantly is the linear decay curve that we see recorded in the Bible. It really fits genetics. And I think the debate, the creation evolution debate, it now comes down to a genetic level, because we know traits are inherited, but bones found in the dirt, they're not inherited. So if we go into, say, the fossil record, okay, because I know you said that fossils um, are one of your, you know, best and most preferred evidence, say, for this pond scum to people evolution. But the thing is, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but it's just such a fact that it's worth repeating. You know, when you find these bones or these fossils found in the dirt, really, in a court of law, none of these fossils can count as evolution. And why would you think that, say, you know, animals or these bones found in the dirt could do something different that animals today can't do, which would be, for one, add new genetic information to the genome, and secondly, stop this entropic degeneration of our genome. So that assumption of universal common ancestry is what interprets the fossils. But if there's no mechanism for universal common ancestry, fish to fisherman evolution, then those interpretations of the fossils, they can't be true, because now it's just circular reasoning. Does that make sense? And if not, you know, what would be your response to what I just said? Go ahead.
Are you saying the circular reasoning is because we date the rocks by the fossils and we date the fossils by the rocks? Is that what you're going off by?
No, I'm not even getting into that. I mean, I don't even think I
Oh,
have to. I'm just saying that if we see that mutations are degrading our genome, but you want to look at a bone found in the dirt and say, hey, this is our ancestor, but at the end of the day, empirically, you know, observationally, we know based on genetics that mutations are accumulating. We have no examples of new information being added to the genome. So instead of saying it's circular, it's a false assumption, is what, you know, these fossils are based on, which means, you know, if you point to something that you say is, you know, transitional, but at the end of the day, genetics points us to the fact that evolution can't be true, well, there must be a different explanation for the fossil record. I mean, if I get, you know what, I think this might help it make sense. If I gave you a hypothetical case, okay, Godless Galaxy, suppose, you know, the finches that we're all so familiar with, let's say they become extinct. And then future researchers, paleontologists, say they come across an island with fossil finches of various beak sizes, okay? Now, suppose that these researchers have a pet theory that early finches had short, stout beaks and gradually evolved to birds with long, thin beaks. He could then collect fossils that showed the early beaks and some with the later beaks, as well as fossils in between. But with the same logic as, neo-Darwinists have used, say on whether it's the fish to amphibian or reptile to mammal or dino to bird, he could actually make a case for his pet theory. But we know that he would be wrong in concluding that, the long, thin beaks evolved gradually from the short, stout beaks, just as his conclusion about finch evolution would be incorrect. So the bottom line is that present day speculation about these transitions, about these bones found in the dirt, and say the progressions, they're nothing more than just so stories with no empirical data to actually back them up. Does that make sense?
Yes, but let me just talk about that. So fossils, which we find, are they are representation. They are examples of populations that have survived, and these fossils are the ones that have been fossilized much quickly or buried. And we can infer because the best population or the most fit population would have, I'm gonna say, have more fossils, but they would be more dominant and they would be in large areas where they could easily be fossilized. I'm just saying this, but and then other populations that rise from this can have mutations that can show a gradual change from the original population to the populations we see, and so it would leave fossils showing up to the gradual change of today. So, like, if one population had big beaks, and then the next population had slightly smaller beaks, it would, and they were more dominant. It would clearly show that. Now, if you could show, like, if you were to say, well, I think the large beaks have slowly evolved into the skinny long beaks, but if you were to show me a long skinny beak from the same time period as that short beak, that would clearly disprove that. But if there is no fossils showing that, then you can take an intelligent guess and say, based on the evidence we have, that this is true, that the, the small beaks slowly evolve into the long ones or whatever. Do
And
you?
and I get what you're saying, but I think the biggest point to be taken from it is that like the fossils that you're talking about, they're really just circumstantial evidence requiring an actual theory that can account for how common descent could have occurred. So such a hypothesis, I wouldn't even call it a theory, must actually account for how the information in living organisms could have been built up in this process of common descent, right? So neither the neo-Darwinian theory nor any other theory presently known is actually able to do this, let alone um, counterbalance the accumulation of deleterious mutations. So that means we have to conclude based on, you know, empirical data genetically that the fossil evidence does not support universal common ancestry because, like I said, genetic entropy, deleterious mutation accumulation, many other genetic reasons make the fossil record or evidence from the fossil record just evidence based on a false assumption, which means it's not evidence at all. You have to be able to explain and provide us a mechanism in order to sufficiently use those fossils as evidence for the theory. But if there's no theory, there's no mechanism for the theory, it's just a hypothesis. And it's really, I mean, did you get what I'm saying?
I understand. If there was some the theory of evolution, if it has been disproven, then it wouldn't be a theory. Now, of course, you keep saying genetics has disproven it, but because we've done genetic testing, like our genome against other genomes, and we can see the difference of our genomes and how our genetics, and we can see that. in the fossils that as we go farther back, the closer their fossils like monkeys or apes and all fossils as they farther go back down in age, they get more similar and similar until you can't tell the difference between them, in which we can conclude with the genetic testing of our genome and their genome that we did share a common ancestor with them.
Are you are you kind of talking about like nested hierarchies and phylogenetic systematics? Because it seems like you're appealing to like these phylogenetic trees, right? Based on, well, I mean, okay, before I address that, I mean, if we don't want to go on a rabbit trail, and we will get into that, that's fun. But if we actually look at the fossils you're talking about, and I'm glad you brought them up because it's certainly, you know, created an engaging conversation. But the fact that fossils exist, I would say, means that there was a global flood, which could actually rapidly bury them, because standard fossilization just won't bury the billions of fossils we see today, right? How do you fossilize an animal while it's exposed on land? You know, like how many animals died today, Godless Galaxy?
Millions and billions, probably.
Yeah, and how many of them were fossilized would be the question.
Probably a few select ones.
Yeah, so I mean, the fact of fossils at all, wouldn't that also be consistent with the biblical model? Because the flood itself, it really does explain the fossil record. Because if you think about it, Godless Galaxy, what we really see in the vast majority of the fossils from top to bottom are marine fossils. 98% of the fossils we see of marine fossils, they're mixed with land fossils. We actually find clams mixed with birds, mixed with horses in all different strata. So the vast majority of fossils in the record are marine. So that's huge. And we see evidence of animals, you know, running from the floodwaters. We find animal tracks before we find the actual animals, vegetation being destroyed, animals being destroyed, the floodwaters. I mean, if you picture it, right, according to the Bible description, the floodwaters come in, recede slowly, gradually, burying organisms in their habitat, slowly building and progressing its way up. Mostly in the upper layers, Godless Galaxy, we see post-flood diversification and dispersion, which is readily explainable through, you know, land bridges, floating mats, say during the ice ages, birds distributing plants and other materials, because animals can be distributed around in very natural means during, say, cataclysmic events like this flood. So isn't that consistent with a biblical creation model as well, based on everything I said? Go ahead.
No, because do denser things and water will fall to the bottom, correct?
Yes.
So why do we see simple organisms like bacteria slowly increase into lighter like bones and fragments into more like vertebrates and many other species that are much denser? I would think dinosaurs would be at the very bottom since they're so dense if this flood were to happen because they would have floated down to the bottom.
Well, see, like if you look at the CPT model, so catastrophic plate tectonics, based on the effects from that, you know, a lot of these organisms would have been buried according to their habitat. So it's not always exactly, you know, what's dense, what's less dense. So based on, you know, the pre-flood world, and based on the fact that God initially created two human beings and an abundance of animals, and based on the fact that that's what we see primarily in the fossil record, you know, that certainly points us to, you know, the flood model. But another thing, you know, because I know you talked about how the record itself shows, you know, simple to complex. It shows from sea creatures to land creatures, um, with sea creatures all over the rock record, right? So it's not actually a record of simple to complex. And based on what you just explained in regards to density, the CPT model would certainly explain that based on a burial of certain ecosystems, habitats, and the fact that dinosaurs were not as smart as humans. So they were buried first, right? So humans obviously can find a way to survive longer than dinosaurs, and birds can fly. We're going to expect to find those at the top. But the fact that we see marine fossils buried with all types of animals, 98% of them are marine fossils. I mean, I don't know any other way to explain that other than a cataclysmic global flood. Go ahead.
So, are you saying that if an animal is faster than another animal, then we should find it above the slower animals?
Well, I wouldn't say
Correct?
always, because I said, a lot of the times it is based on habitats, based on ecosystems. So it's not always based on, I mean, a lot of it could be explained that way based on, what's going to escape the floodwaters longer. But based on, the tsunamis, the rising tides, a lot of it will just be explainable through habitats and ecosystems.
All right. So, you're saying since humans are smarter, you should find them at the top, correct?
I would say based on the fact that God didn't create as many humans. Initially there wouldn't have been as many humans on the earth pre-flood as there would have been um, animals. So yeah, I would say we'd predict limited human fossils, but yeah, I'd also say that we'd predict them for the ones we do find, primarily on the top. And also, if this flood, like for example, the fountains of the Great Deep breaking open, if that started in the oceans, we'd expect marine fossils to be buried first. So it's pretty simple, and it's a pretty simple progression given a flood model. Go ahead.
So you're saying that because there were very limited populations of humans that we would rarely find them, correct?
Yeah, I would say that's a valid conclusion. But the thing is, you know, humans also lived on
So
higher
why have
elevations.
we not? Mm,
Like if we look at the Genesis account, the four
yes.
rivers of Genesis, humans lived on higher elevations, right? So that would also explain, what we see in the fossil record in regards to um, humans as well. Because if if we notice the marine creatures are located, right? I mean, we got Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic. At the bottom, Precambrian, Cambrian, and so on. We notice that marine creatures are located in the bottom half of this, say geologic column, while land creatures are located in the top half of the column. But just like I said before, based on a biblical model, there's good reason for that based on the fact that the flood obviously started in the ocean. So wouldn't you agree that naturally marine creatures would be buried first? Isn't
Yes,
that
but
kind of
also
expected or no?
yes, that would also that would prove evolution too, because evolution teaches that we started in the ocean and we slowly build it up as fishes and salamanders. So there would be a lot more fossils of us and marines in the marines. There would be more fossils in the marines because we spent a good amount of time in the marines, and then we would slowly develop on the land. You don't see, you don't see. I don't know exactly. You don't see a shark, a great white shark, be near a Mesosaurus or whatever.
Well, the thing
It,
is, a lot of it, like I said, will be based on habitats, ecosystems, elevations, pre-flood, because but the thing is, we even have empirical data, right? Because if we look at, say, the eruption at Mount St. Helens, what did that demonstrate? Godless Galaxy, right? It did demonstrate that, and this is a lower level event too, as compared to what the global flood would have created. I mean, we see that sedimentary layers hundreds of feet thick, and I'm sure you're familiar with Mount St. Helens, but these layers could be laid down in hours to days. We see that canyons can be formed quickly. We've seen multiple fossilized forests could form as a result of one single volcanic eruption. And we can also see possibly how, coal seams could be produced. So it seems like these observations are in accord with the flood of Noah, but I understand what you're saying on how there is a competing explanation based on pond scum to people evolution. So that's why I think, like I said earlier, fossils are not inherited, traits are inherited. So when we look at a genetic level, and you brought up a good point earlier about nested hierarchies, as well as phylogenetic systematics. Now, if you want to make a couple points on what I said in regards to the flood, but I also wanted you to, because I think that was a smart thing to bring up phylogenetic systematics. If you could explain to us what about the phylogenetic systematics, what about genetics, genetic similarities demonstrates universal common ancestry. Go ahead.
Phylogenetics demonstrates that the bigger the difference between you and some other animal, the farther you were separated. So the longer you were separated from your common ancestor. So so compare a human genome to a mouse genome, they would have been the last mammal split off, because mammals were originally mouse-like, and then they split off and stuff. So the farther apart the genetics or genetic difference, then the farther your ancestors splitted.
Now, and that's a good point. Now, are you familiar with the fact that phylogenetic systematics, as you're talking about here, it's mostly based on the concept of outdated junk DNA? So since functions are only beginning to be found, say during the last decade, meaning we actually understand less than 5% of the DNA language, the trajectory, and I will also say that a lot of the data is preliminary, but the trajectory is most important. It strongly suggests that the vast majority of DNA will be functional. Now, why that does not bode well for phylogenetic systematics is because this takes away the primary assumption of evolutionary phylogenetics, which is actually based on mutations for one, and pseudogenes, right? Genetic markers. But if the vast majority of DNA is functional, as we're seeing now, Godless Galaxy, it now becomes a common design argument. And what's nice and revealing is that creationists have always predicted that the vast majority of DNA is functional. So this functionality is certainly a problem and inconsistency for phylogenetic systematics. What do you think?
So you're saying that because we do not completely understand each function of DNA, that's like one of the reasons why we can't use phylogenetics?
Well, because a lot of these, phylogenetic trees, they're based on genetic markers that are assumed to be, mutation related, or let's use pseudogenes, for example, plagiarized mistakes or what they would call them, right? And if they really are plagiarized mistakes, that would certainly be strong evidence for universal common ancestry. But in regards to the ENCODE project, they found out that at least 80% of the non-coding DNA was actually transcribed into RNA, right? So that actually suggests function, but it's also been found that these non-coding regions, and most of our genome is actually non-protein coding. I'm sure you're aware of that. But it's now known that these regions of genomes correlate with biological complexity even better than the protein coding regions. So that actually suggests that these non-coding regions, Godless Galaxy, they carry significant information, say for regulatory activity. But a big thing as well as ENCODE, they didn't look at the portions of the genome involved primarily and exclusively in development. So that type of DNA would only have function then. So that means the trajectory of discovery favors genome-wide functionality very strongly. Probably, there's certainly a lot more function in the genome than evolutionists formally assumed. But the point is if these genetic markers are actually functional DNA differences, they can't be used as plagiarized mistakes to build these phylogenetic trees. That's the point. You know what I mean? That's the point. So now these trees just remain in the realm of hypotheses. right? Now, that's why the battle, rages on. Did ENCODE really detect function, or is it just spurious transcription? But if it really is function, once again, genetics points to common design. Like, do you understand what I just said there?
Sort of. So you're saying because these markers they will claim to be mistakes or whatever, but that's a way to disprove evolution.
Well, because a prediction based on pre-existing heterozygosity would be that the non-coding regions are functional. Okay, but evolution says that there will be much non-functionality, so they use a lot of those, say, pseudo genes, which are actually in those areas, as genetic markers to build their trees. But like I said, in regards to ENCODE, the ENCODE project, these results have suggested that at least 80% of the human genome is functional. But as I said, is the results are preliminary, right? I've talked to scientists on this. I wouldn't want to straw man the ENCODE and what some of the evolutionary scientists are saying. They'll say that a lot of it could possibly be spurious transcription. But one thing is clear, is that most non-coding DNA is at least not idle. It's doing something. Now, why would the cell be wasting so much energy transcribing if it's not really doing any useful activity? So I think that's kind of a rescue device on behalf of the evolutionists. But I think the whole point is, if these pseudogenes, if these genetic markers that are being used to build the phylogenetic trees are functional, then that means these phylogenetic trees are just based on a false assumption that molecules to man evolution is true. But now we know it's not true. So they really are just lines on paper. And lines on paper don't prove a thing, right?
Yes. Um, do you know humans cannot produce vitamin? I think it's vitamin D. Have to do to eat oranges. You know that vitamin?
You talking about vitamin C? Are you talking about the? Are you talking about the pseudo gene?
Um, I don't know exactly what it's called, but
Yeah, like it's. I think what you're getting at, it's a shared mistake, because we're not able to make
produce
our own
vitamin
vitamin
C.
C. Yeah, we can't produce our own vitamin C, and also monkeys and mice can't produce their own vitamin C. So that's what I'm talking about. That's a pseudo gene. That's what the evolutionists call a plagiarized mistake that is found in the same area as many of these mammals. I noticed you got some background noise there. Is everything okay, Godless Galaxy?
I've been out there jacking around all by myself trying to get stuff done because you were so tired. And what I tell you to do? What I tell you not to do?
I'll mute you. I've got you on mute there whenever you're now. You'll have to unmute yourself, Godless Galaxy, when I want to pull up a slide here before you come back, just for the audience, because the functionality of our genome is certainly significant in regards to the biblical based model. Now, I think genetic entropy itself, as demonstrated many times, is clear evidence for biblical creation and evidence against evolution. But if we actually look at the created heterozygosity model, I want to make sure that you can see this slide here, but created heterozygosity in regards to functional DNA is quite revealing, because if a major objection from evolutionists is that millions of species in only 6,000 years is not plausible, it's actually not a problem now, because if God created original created kinds with millions of heterozygous DNA sites, these millions of DNA differences would amount to massive amounts of DNA variety. And this DNA variety is encoded into each kind from the start of their creation. So I think it's plausible and logical that the potential for speciation really is mind-boggling. But why this is important in regards to the ENCODE discussion of this debate is that combined with the fact that species can actually recover massive population sizes in only very short amounts of time. And I would certainly direct you to a paper by Dr. Nathaniel Jensen in regard to finches and how there was an observed shift from hetero to homo, producing new species quickly. But in addition to the fact that the vast majority of DNA sequences, as we were talking about earlier, within a creature appear to be functional, these results demonstrate that millions of species in a few thousand years is not only plausible, but probable. And I think it's intellectually dishonest for evolutionists to use that argument, especially if this model is making testable and falsifiable predictions. We'll see if, let me see here. I'm going to see if Godless Galaxy is able to continue the discussion. If you're listening, Godless Galaxy, I've got you on mute because you had some background noise there. So if you wanted to continue talking, you'd have to take the mute button off. But if we even go back to the flood portion, since we were moving around, I would say that for marine creatures, smaller creatures would be buried first logically because they're smaller and more movable. And he was talking about sharks. So bigger creatures, say like sharks, can actually be buried a little bit later because they're larger and harder to move. So there's certainly a lot of plausible reasons and explanations for what we observe in the fossil record. I think if this debate was mostly about evidence for models, I think the biblical model was certainly the stronger model. I'm just going to look in the chat here. Can everybody hear me okay? I've got Godless Galaxy on mute there. We agreed to go for an hour. It's been over an hour, so he might have to go. But I think another prediction involves mitochondrial DNA. If I can actually share a slide here. It was working earlier, but let me, so if this is, okay, so I'm going to screen share. Okay, perfect. I'm going to present to everybody. Now, if I look here, we look at mitochondrial DNA differences. Hopefully everybody can see this. This is chimp to human mitochondrial DNA. Now, the thing is, evolutionary timescale predicts too many differences. Evolution predicted over 6 million to 13 million years, over 28,000, but the actual amount, only 1,400. Now, as you can see here in this slide, without natural selection as a rescuing device, evolutionists are left with this major problem because the mutation rates, especially in regards to mitochondrial DNA, are more consistent with a biblical creation model. And there's been more done as well because we've got, let's see here, right here. So genetic clocks, they record the time of roundworm origins. We see that evolution predicted far more than what was predicted by creation. And the actual amount, 1,700 or 1,179 to 1,700 would be the higher end. So once again, more consistent with creation. So genetics confirms biblical creation. Nuclear DNA differences, they'd be predicted to be a lot of them, large portion of them, probably over 90%, created pre-existing functional DNA differences. Now that would explain, so that means the nuclear DNA rates, the nuclear DNA differences are explained perfectly with the creation model, as well as the mitochondrial DNA rates. Now, obviously evolutionists can make testable predictions on this in regards to natural selection. So until they do, any explanation they have is in the realm of pseudoscience, because genetics is really confirming creation and a biblical model. And if you've watched the debate with Herman Mays and Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, a huge portion and a huge part of replacing Darwin was the fact that nuclear DNA differences are the result of not mutation in the biblical model, but pre-existing heterozygosity. And there was a huge straw man coming from Dr. Mays, and Dr. Jensen was simply asking a question on, what does his book say about nuclear DNA rates, nuclear DNA differences, and he couldn't answer that, which to me was proof positive that he either read the book and didn't, read it with an open mind, because a major part of it was this pre-existing heterozygosity. So we can see here that, genetics points to biblical creation, bones found in the dirt, they're not evidence for pond scum to people evolution, because it's based on a faulty assumption. There's no mechanism. There's nothing that's going to stop the entropic degeneration of our genome. The biblical model is certainly stronger than ever, I think, would be what's most to take from this. I think for now it's been over an hour. Godless Galaxy said that he had an hour. It's been a good discussion. Godless Galaxy, if you can hear me, I've got you on mute. You'll have to unmute yourself. Can you hear me, Godless Galaxy?
Yes.
Okay. Are you still free for some? I put you on mute because I know there's background noise. I didn't want, there's no reason the audience had to hear all that. Are you free to discuss a little bit more, or are you? I know you said you wanted to go for an hour. It's been about an hour and 20 minutes.
I would like to do a quick rebuttal, and then I can do my closing, and that can be the end of this.
I think, you know what, especially if you heard anything that I said in the last couple minutes, and then anything I said before you were interrupted, give a rebuttal. I might give a couple points and then give a concluding statement, and maybe we can set this up again. I can recommend a few rebuttals to genetic entropy that I'm aware of, a few papers, and then that way we can have more of, say, a scientific-based discussion on it. Could be fun. But go ahead, give a rebuttal, and then we'll go from there.
Question sources from exactly how I don't know exactly what sources you used, but and then I did see the debate between Myers and doubting Darwin or whatever, replacing Darwin, and I can conclude that he shouldn't read a 300-page book and remember everything he said, but that point Nelson or whatever his name was demanding exactly what he said. And it's kind of difficult to remember everything from a single book. You were talking about how we would find how you said it lined up, like the fossil record lined up with the creationist model. I would say that it kind of doesn't, as we have lighter materials at the bottom and not heavier at the bottom. And we also see some fossils, like I don't know exactly where it's from, but at this park they show you layers, and it shows you, like, I think some sort of a mammal of some sort, and then the next layer there's a turtle, and then the next one there's like a wolf or something. I don't know exactly what that's called, but there is layers, and it's quite odd that these land animals would be covered up by water animals or like marine animals. And that's kind of the end of my rebuttal. And if you have anything to say, and after you say whatever you have to say, then I'll do my concluding.
No, I mean, I think, I'm not sure if you heard what I said earlier in regards to say, I would say, you know, the distribution of fossils. I would say fossils in general, you know, a proof of rapid burial. Like you said before, you know, how many animals died today? Millions, billions. You know, how many are going to fossilize? Probably none. We see some pretty funky fossils. You know, we see fossils of fish eating each other, clams by the gazillions. Like I said, you know, 98% of the fossil record are marine. In regard to the marine creatures, you know, because I know you had a rebuttal there with sharks. Smaller creatures would obviously be buried first. I think that's logical because they're smaller and more movable, while bigger creatures like, you know, sharks can certainly be buried a little bit later based on their size and based on their inability to move, say, as quick. Also based on habitats, based on ecosystems, based on the rivers, the four rivers of Genesis. You know, many ecosystems of animals would have been already at higher layers, while other higher ground, while other ones have been at lower. In the catastrophic plate tectonic model, I mean, I think with the rising tide, the water moving in, moving out, I think it's going to, and obviously fossilized foot tracks. I think these are certainly all readily explainable in a biblical model. But if you want to use, say, you know, the fossil record and the distribution of fossils to point to, you know, single-celled ancestor evolving into, say, a human over billions of years, I would say that you'd first have to explain how a single-celled ancestor could evolve into a human, because obviously novel traits must be gained, right? New anatomical structures and new functions, say muscular and muscle activities, they have to be gained, they have to be acquired. So regardless of whether this is, say, proposed to occur through whether it's beneficial mutations, actually, I should ask you before we end it, do you have, you know, any solid examples of of, say, a mutation that actually added novel information to the genome? Like, do you have, like, what would be your best explanation of, because I know there's lots of examples of degraded information, right? Sickle cell anemia, aerobic citrate digestion by bacteria, nylon digestion. Certainly, you know, they all involve decay of prior information, but like, what would be your best example of an information adding mutation, Godless Galaxy?
I think it was a couple hundred years ago. We couldn't be able to drink milk after a certain age, but there was a certain mutation that was able to allow us to drink milk after a certain age, and which is why some people are lactose intolerant, because they can't drink milk at a certain point. And you can also say that I would say it's beneficial, but blue eyes was a mutation that was added to the genome of humans, and it quickly spread.
I mean, from what I understand, you know, European adult lactose tolerance, that appears to be due to a broken lactase promoter. And, you know, even, you know, like I said earlier, you know, the sickle cell anemia is due to a broken hemoglobin protein. There's another big one that I've seen used. It's has to do with immunity of, I think, an estimated 20% of Europeans to HIV infection. That's actually due to a broken receptor. So sure, beneficials happen, but it seems like they are all loss of function mutations, and they're very rare. So for one, beneficial mutations are not going to counterbalance the entropic degeneration of our genome. They're not going to build the genome. I think this would be my concluding statement. I think genetics, I mean, fossils are not inherited, traits are. Genetics certainly points to biblical creation. Mitochondrial DNA rates, they certainly point to a young genome. Nuclear DNA rates can be, or nuclear DNA differences can be readily explained by pre-existing heterozygosity. The fact that our genome is being proven more and more to be functional. A lot of it is preliminary, but more and more functional roles are coming out every single day. ERVs, endogenous retroviruses, those are now shown to be functional, playing important roles in the placenta. There's just so much in the genetic realm that I think it's pretty evident that universal common ancestry can't be true. So these phylogenetic trees are certainly based on a faulty assumption. And I think there's just so much overwhelming evidence for biblical creation, not only in the genetic realm. I think that confirms it solidly, but even in the geology and the historical records, I think it's hard to deny. And I know in 2 Peter 3, it talks about how in the last days there's going to be scoffers willingly ignorant of 3 things: the creation, the flood, and the coming judgment. And what I find funny is this is what we're all arguing about today. So I think that's a fulfilled prophecy. And I think that's pretty, it's pretty flabbergasting that, a lot of atheists can read that and at the same time deny those things, since that's exactly what is predicted to be denied in these last days. That would be my concluding statement. If you have a few more things to say in conclusion as well, Godless Galaxy, go ahead. I also want to thank you for coming on, and maybe we can set up another discussion if you're open to it. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you for having me too, and I hope that we could have many more discussions after this one. But yes, you say many things that Bible prophecy and end of judgment and stuff are all somehow aligning, but as atheists haven't just popped out in the last decade, they've been around for quite a while, and evidence against many things the Bible claims has been given. I'm not a complete expert in genetics, but I hope to learn more after this discussion, since I've already learned a lot. But maybe next discussion I'll come back a little bit much more knowledgeable. And,
No, I think you did good. I appreciate you coming on. I'll send you some material. I mean, I, for one, like to read both sides. I'll send you some material, and we can have a few more of these. I think you were pleasant to talk to, respectful, and hopefully profitable, Godless Galaxy. So hopefully, you do a little more with your channel, and people can profit from yours. But yeah, all I want to say is thanks for coming on. We'll do it again sometime. And guys, Standing for Truth is out. Hope you all enjoyed. January 3rd, I've got a formal debate, moderated debate with Jackson Weed on Modern Day Hysteria's channel, so that should be fun. And this week, we should have a couple live streams with some creationists. So there's certainly a lot to look forward to on this channel, guys. Have a great night.